My goal today is to share with you my latest project. My project concerns the international in Florentine Renaissance art. Renaissance, Florence. We logically associate Florentine art with Florence itself. And well, we should. Florence did produce major works of art, from Brunelleschi's Dome and Botticelli's Venus to Michelangelo's David. Yet from the blue on this virgin's robe that came from Afghanistan to Galileo's own drawings of the moon, Florentine art was always a much bigger affair. That bigger Florence is my project. In full, my project will actually take me from a very dirty Michelangelo in Rome to the very undirty Jackie Kennedy and her coup in securing the loan of Leonardo's Mona Lisa to the United States. Today, I offer you neither dirt nor Camelot, but a more limited case study. Looking at sculpture, I shall present an expanded Florence that was home, and occasionally not, to artists like Michelangelo and Leonardo. Something brought Michelangelo on the left and the little-known Pietro Torrigiano to fisticuffs in their youth. Torrigiano delivered a blow that forever disfigured Michelangelo's nose. That scuffle is not the only thing that divided these artists. Even though Michelangelo often worked away from his native city, he remains the consummate Florentine artist. Torrigiano is now wholly absent from histories of Florentine sculpture. Leaving Florence, Torrigiano moved to Rome, and then further away to the Netherlands, England, and Spain. Here is his tomb of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York in Westminster Abbey. On the right, a Saint Jerome from his Spanish period. Unlike Michelangelo, Torrigiano left the Florentine Renaissance. Or did he? Torrigiano's case intrigues me to ask, what was the geographic reach of Florentine sculpture? In his Florentine Renaissance sculpture, Charles Avery defines what he means by that subject. When a sculptor's career leads outside of Florence, Avery writes, my narrative follows for continuity. Avery's narrative takes us to Siena with Ghiberti and Donatello, to Padua with Donatello, and to Venice with Verrocchio. Avery then takes us to Milan with Leonardo, and to Rome with Palaiolo and Michelangelo. We follow Avery to Montepulciano with Michelozzo, to Prato with Michelozzo and Donatello, to Naples with Benedetto da Maiano, and to Pistoia with Verrocchio. These are all famous trips of famous Florentine artists. Yet as quickly as possible, Avery always returns us to Florence. Yet was Florentine sculpture beyond the city so peripheral that it need be accommodated only in the interest of narrative continuity? Maybe not. Charles Seymour writes, the Italian sculptor was mobile. He moved about as work became available. Agostino di Duccio, whose Angels from Rimini you see here, was one such mobile Florentine sculptor. Seymour includes this map on which he traces the working paths of key Florentine sculptors. The different emphases of Avery and Seymour beg two questions. Are these scholars examining the same Florentine tradition? And if so, can we reconcile Avery's more local approach with Seymour's more geographically expansive mapping of Florentine sculpture? Let us first establish what Florence was in the Renaissance. Florence was this Florence, our Florence. But Florence was also a territorial state shown here that encompassed nearly all of modern Tuscany. Florence was additionally an economic empire that extended well beyond the Italian peninsula. Here a map of Florentine business interests abroad. Florentines went north to London, west to Spain, east to Jerusalem and further still, and south across the Mediterranean to North Africa. The city's maps and the Florentine Amerigo Vespucci even contributed to the discovery and naming of this new world. So everywhere were Florentines that Pope Boniface VIII famously remarked that the earth is made up of 5 elements: earth, water, air, fire, and Florentines. This everywhere-ness of Florentines was differently captured by the historian Ferdinand Braudel in how he indexed Florence and Florentines in his study of the Mediterranean. Braudel simply wrote passim. Passim, meaning various places and throughout, could equally serve as the indexical reference for Florentine sculptors. The city's sculptors were active throughout Florentine Tuscany. Indeed, it is difficult to identify a locality in the territory that did not engage the services of a Florentine sculptor. Here, Donatello and Michelozzo's pulpit at Prato. I could list many other examples, but I will suggest the nature, if not the volume, of this trade by one anecdote. In 1427, Michelozzo declared that he and Donatello owned a mule because it is convenient for our frequent goings and comings. Donatello and Michelozzo are not well known to art history for their hoofed chattel. Rather, they are known by their works, like this tomb in Florence, that contributes to our understanding of how central Florence was to the Renaissance. Nonetheless, these sculptors needed and doubtless overworked that mule as transportation to jobs far beyond the city. They also relied upon other modes of transportation, like barges, for commissions much further away from Tuscany. They were not alone in this constant moving about. The list is long of Florentine sculptors working around the peninsula. It includes the Lamberti family and Verrocchio in Padua and Venice, Ghiberti in Pesaro and Siena, Agostino di Duccio in Urbino and Rimini, and Bernardo Rossellino, Filarete, Mino da Fiesole, and the Palaiolo brothers in Rome. Filarete and Leonardo worked in Milan. Antonio Rossellino and Benedetto da Maiano labored in Naples. And Michelangelo worked in Bologna and Rome in addition to Florence. Among the more prolific artists executing commissions beyond Florence was Donatello. Records attest to Donatello's work in Ferrara, Mantua, Modena, Naples, Orvieto, Padua, Prato, Rome, Siena, and Venice. So often did Florentine sculptors work abroad that this traveling tradition even entered into the fictional imagination of new Renaissance cities. Envisioning a hypothetical satellite city of Milan, Filarete, himself a Florentine artist away from Rome, lists a whole host of Florentine sculptors whom he would engage in its fabrication. Of course, there were Florentine sculptors who worked even distantly from Italy. This one. Dello Delli worked in Spain, and Michelozzo in Dubrovnik and on the Isle of Chios. Benedetto da Maiano delivered works of art from Lorenzo de' Medici to Matthias Corvinus of Hungary. The Medici ruler also sent Andrea Sansovino to Portugal, and later Pietro Torrigiano worked first in Rome and then in the Netherlands, England, and Spain after mixing it up with Michelangelo in the Medici Sculpture Garden in Florence. Here is a romantic 19th century depiction of the sweet boy Michelangelo at work in that garden where he was later roughed up by Torrigiano. The work that Michelangelo precociously did in the garden is generally referenced to affirm the Florentine nature of his formation. But it was also there that Michelangelo and Torrigiano received their training in the rudiments of Florentine art that would stand them well in their careers that took them well beyond their native city. In Michelangelo's case, that work took him constantly back and forth from Florence to Rome. Here I show Michelangelo's Moses in Rome and Torrigiano's Henry VII in England. And here is Michelangelo's David from Florence and Torrigiano's St. Jerome from Spain. All very Florentine works. Florentine sculpture was clearly both local and non-local. But how separated was all this distant sculpture? Not entirely. Even in Florence, the sculptor's workshop, shown in this relief, could be a surprisingly international place. Certain foreign commissions were executed in whole or in part in Florentine workshops before they were transported to their final destinations. The wax model for Verrocchio's horse and rider in Venice was made in Florence. It was then delivered to the island city to be cast in bronze. This example suggests that some Florentine sculpture was actually completed elsewhere by sculptors whose names are not generally associated with those works. This happened with Donatello's Feast of Herod, that the artist began in Florence, and then other unknown hands finished it in Siena. This also happened with this tomb by Donatello and Michelozzo in Naples. Many of its pieces were carved into finished form only after they arrived in Naples. In some notable cases, Florentine artists may never have witnessed the completion of their works for distant locations. It makes me wonder how many Renaissance masterpieces are not entirely by the masters themselves. Foreign buyers could also come to Florence to negotiate with sculptors. A Genoese merchant visited Florence intent on acquiring a work by Donatello. In other situations, foreigners commissioned works from Florentine sculptors, intending for those works to remain in Florence. The most famous example of this is this chapel of a Portuguese prince who died in Florence. Another is this tomb of the patriarch of the Eastern Church. Both of these works are in prominent Florentine churches. Of a much more ephemeral nature were the foreign commissions of sculptural ex votos that the Florentine sculptors installed in this church. The man depicted in Donatello's statue in Padua was one of these patrons. Finally, there were Florentine sculptors who actually turned away or deferred foreign commissions because of more pressing local commitments. Desiderio da Settignano deflected requests from the Milanese Duke Francesco Sforza that he produce Madonnas like this one. Likewise, too busy in Florence, Benedetto da Maiano held the town of San Gimignano at arm's length while he finished work for the Florentine government. And then there is the odd Renaissance story that ahistorically features Donatello and the ancient king Nebuchadnezzar. Donatello asserts that he can do no work for the king until he finishes his pulpit at Prato. So even in literature, did commissions for home and away come into the same conversations and at times into direct conflict with one another. Still, Florentine sculptors eagerly sought commissions elsewhere. The best-known example is Leonardo's famous letter to the Duke of Milan. Leonardo boasts that he can do anything, including sculpture. Less boastfully, Desiderio da Settignano, Andrea del Verrocchio, and Giuliano da Maiano all contributed designs for a chapel in the cathedral at Orvieto. Florentine sculptors working abroad also kept close tabs on opportunities that arose for commissions at home. Ghiberti was in Pesaro when he learned of the famous baptistry doors competition. And Michelangelo hurried home from Rome when his daddy let him know that there was a possibility to carve a David. Florentine sculptural workshops were clearly far from local enterprises. What is more, they were not always located in Florence. Donatello and Michelozzo had a workshop in Pisa, while working on this tomb for Naples. And even within Florentine workshops, such as this one, multiple jobs for home and away were often simultaneously in process. This is important because the passage of influence from one work intended for Florence to another destined for a distant foreign location could be measured not in miles or days or long periods spent elsewhere. Instead, it could be measured in the split second of a glance or a comment or a few paces of walking to lay hands on different projects for Florentines and foreigners alike. An example, these works were intended for home on the left and Venice on the right. They both existed in Verrocchio's Florentine workshop at about the same time. If we imagine the conversations between Verrocchio and his assistants about these different works, their meanings, their patrons, and their destinations, the Renaissance workshop becomes a very interesting place. Notably, Verrocchio was Leonardo's teacher. It was largely from Verrocchio that I believe Leonardo learned that his Florentine art could work just about anywhere. What then happened to works of sculpture like Donatello's Feast of Herod or this Baptist for Venice after they left Florence or were produced by Florentine sculptors in distant locations? Did these works remain essentially Florentine, or did they become something different? I was thinking about this question a while back when passing through Memphis, Tennessee. Not far from Graceland, this hound dog of an art historian became all shook up when I came upon this copy of Michelangelo's David. Here, Michelangelo's masterpiece is shorter, made of concrete, and shares space with a Confederate soldier. Whistling Dixie, David in this context takes on a very different meaning. Admittedly, that meaning is nowhere near as far removed from the original as occurs in other examples. I point to this Chinese advertisement for hernia surgery, or this Fruit of the Loom hero boy of a few years back in American politics. Yet in all serious return to the Renaissance, might less dramatic, though still meaningful instances of interpretive transformation have occurred when works of Florentine sculpture were received and understood by non-Florentine viewers. Here is Michelangelo's Madonna that the artist made for Bruges. Of course, the Renaissance occasionally translated well to other parts of the world. No great divide separates Donatello's Florentine man on the left from Torrigiano's much later English gent, or Palaiolo's papal tomb, again on the left in Rome, from Torrigiano's tomb of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York in England. And how striking are the similarities between Michelangelo's Bruges Madonna and Torrigiano's Madonna from Seville. Nevertheless, I wonder what local traditions of form and meaning, context and reception intermingled to make Torrigiano's Spanish Saint Jerome ultimately Spanish and still somewhat Florentine. What I can say is this: Boniface VIII was only partly right about Florentines being everywhere. The Renaissance world was made up of not 5 elements, but 6: earth, water, and air, fire, Florentines, and Florentine sculptors. And maybe Michelangelo with his Moses and Torrigiano with his Jerome actually had a good deal in common as Florentine sculptors by virtue of their international careers. And maybe still, that alone allowed them, and now allows art history, to bury the hatchet of whatever it was that led to that first punch and the resulting knockout of Torrigiano from the all-too Florentine conception of Florentine Renaissance sculpture. Thank you.